Hey friends, this is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff. Today I'm doing something very different. I am giving you a big announcement, which is that my book, Bipolar Answers, is going to be up for pre-sale by the time you're listening to this. That means that you can go on Amazon and just for the ebook right now, you can select to pre-buy the book so that it's automatically delivered to your phone or Kindle at the time that it's released. And the official release date is going to be, that's my drum roll, April 16th. So coming up soon. I'm doing this for multiple reasons. For one, I want you guys to be able to get the book quickly. I want you to be excited about the book if it's something that you're interested in. I also need a deadline for myself. I have done everything in the book except for a few loose ends in terms of formatting, getting the cover all figured out and stuff like that. And yeah, I am very excited about it. This has been a labor of love. If you don't remember, the book is called Bipolar Answers, Questions from Real People Answered by a Real Psychologist. And it is from this show. Over the years, I've answered a lot of questions that you guys have sent in about bipolar disorder. And so I take those questions and I give the responses that are kind of from the podcast, but also very much expanded out. So I will include information like case studies. I include information like tables of the difference between symptoms of borderline personality disorder and bipolar, how to tell the difference between ADHD and bipolar 2, what the heck is the difference between bipolar 1 and 2, do you have to have depression to have bipolar? What happens when you have psychosis from bipolar? How do you talk to your workplace or school about bipolar? What does bipolar look like in children? How do you deal with it in relationships? I cover a lot of stuff, and I really do like the book. I think that it's a nice blend of my early books with sort of just my personality coming through, as well as just really rigorous, great information. So what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to read for you the introduction and one of the chapters. When I say chapters, it's basically each one goes from a different question and I expand upon it. So I'm going to give you the introduction, talk about the book, talk about bipolar itself. And then in the chapter that I'm going to read to you, this is about somebody trying to go back to school after an episode. So we talk about their experience as well as some advice about advocating for yourself, requesting accommodations and that sort of thing. So it gives you a flavor of what the book will be like. So if you would be so kind, please check out the description of the video that you're watching or the show notes for the podcast if you're listening to the audio. Check out the link. It's going to send you to Amazon so you can pre-order the book. Share it with a friend if you have somebody who might be interested in it. And I can't wait to release this to you guys. So without further ado, sit back and enjoy the introduction and this chapter from Bipolar Answers. Introduction. Bipolar can be a huge pain in the ass. You picked up this book, so it's safe to assume that either you have bipolar, have a loved one with bipolar, or are trying to understand bipolar better. So I may be preaching to the choir here, but bipolar truly is a unique kind of suck. Not only do you get crippling depression, but for a limited time, you get 2 psychiatric symptoms for the price of 1. You get to have moments of feeling energetic and amazing, only to realize weeks later that you were completely out of your mind from sleep deprivation, and you made so many impulsive decisions that you're now at risk of losing your relationship. Not fun. This is only compounded by the fact that for some reason, people still don't understand what the hell bipolar actually is. Like, oh my God, I'm so bipolar. No, Becky, you're not bipolar. You're just indecisive and get moody from time to time. Asshole. Sorry. That got a little intense. Let me take a step back here. My name is Dr. Robert Duff. I'm a clinical psychologist from Southern California, and if you've not encountered any of my work, my whole shtick is mental health for real people. That's why it sounds like I'm talking directly to you rather than writing some lofty, academically detached book. I wanted to write a book about bipolar for a long time. As I alluded to above, it's a very misunderstood disorder. Not just by normies without any psychological issues, but also by people who have bipolar. I can't tell you how many patients that I've seen in my clinical practice that have told me they have bipolar, but they have no idea what that actually means because their doctor didn't explain it to them. Aside from practicing as a psychologist, I also have a weekly show called the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, in which I answer listener questions. It turns out that I've answered a whole bunch of questions about bipolar on the show, which got me thinking that maybe I should compile all those questions and make a book out of it. So, lucky reader, that's what you have stumbled into here. After starting with a general introduction to bipolar, we are going to revisit real questions that were asked by real people just like you. Rather than just regurgitating the response I gave in the episode, I'll be diving deeper, including more resources and trying to cover just about all the bases you need to understand when it comes to the magnificent beast that is bipolar. A note on language. Please be aware that I write in a somewhat unique way. I've been known to drop some spicy language, and I try to educate in my normal voice, which is a blend of academic speak and normal dude vernacular. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's important for me to be authentic. If you've ever listened to the show or read a book of mine, you already know what I'm talking about. While the frame is based around my podcast, you do not need to be a listener to get a ton out of this book. The questions asked on the show simply provide a platform to discuss issues you likely won't find in any other book about bipolar. For example, I address questions like, how can you tell the difference between ADHD and bipolar? Do you have to be on medication for bipolar? What does bipolar look like in kids? How can I talk to my job about bipolar? And how can I support a loved one with bipolar? So with all that said, let's get into the good stuff. Before diving into the first question, I want to define bipolar and make sure that we're on the same page about the disorder. There are various ways to define and categorize mental disorders. Since I am a psychologist, I use a book, more like a tome, called the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's currently in the text revision of the 5th edition, so DSM-5-TR. When I reference criteria or specifics regarding classification of disorders in this book, that's what I'm referring to. Back in the day, bipolar was referred to as manic depressive disorder. Currently, we simply use the term bipolar. Technically, there are several disorders under the bipolar umbrella. They include bipolar 1, bipolar 2, cyclothymic disorder, substance or medication-induced bipolar and related disorders, bipolar and related disorder due to another medical condition, other specified bipolar and related disorder, unspecified bipolar and related disorder. Later in this book, I will explain a few of these disorders, but for now, let's focus on good old bipolar 1. One more note on classification. All the disorders listed above are in a category called bipolar and related disorders in the DSM-5-TR. They were previously grouped together with depressive disorders under the mood disorder umbrella. However, in the current DSM, they get their own category, which is meant to highlight the importance in recognizing the unique symptoms and treatment needed for bipolar disorders. Obviously, with bipolar, we're talking about two poles of mood, but truly the disorder is characterized by the manic phase. In bipolar 1, you must meet criteria for a manic episode, which can be followed by or preceded by depression or hypomania, and we'll cover hypomania later. Diagnostic criteria for a manic episode. A distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive or irritable mood and abnormally and persistently increased goal-directed activity or energy, lasting at least 1 week and present most of the day, nearly every day, or any duration if hospitalization is necessary. B, during the period of mood disturbance and increased energy or activity, 3 or more of the following symptoms, 4 if mood is only irritable, are present to a significant degree and represent a noticeable change from usual behavior. 1. Inflated self-esteem or grandiosity. 2. Decreased need for sleep. For example, feels rested after only 3 hours of sleep. 3. More talkative than usual or pressure to keep talking. 4. Flight of ideas or subjective sense that thoughts are racing. 5. Distractibility as reported or observed. 6. Increase in goal-directed activity, socially, at work, at school, or sexually. Or psychomotor agitation, i.e. purposeless, non-goal-directed activity. 7. Excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. For example, buying sprees, risky sexual behaviors, or foolish business investments. C. The mood disturbance is sufficiently severe to cause marked impairment in social or occupational functioning, or to necessitate hospitalization, or if there are psychotic features. D. The episode is not due to the physiological effects of a substance or due to another medical condition. At least 1 lifetime manic episode is required for a diagnosis of bipolar 1 disorder. There is quite a bit to unpack here with all the technical jargon, so let me point out a few things from that definition. Firstly, have a look at the duration of the episode. To qualify as a manic episode, the change in mood and behavior needs to last for at least 1 week. That's why bipolar is not just about being moody. Next, I'd like to point out the decreased need for sleep criteria. This is not the same thing as insomnia, where you may be tired to the bone, but you just can't get yourself to fall asleep. Rather, in bipolar, you don't feel like you need sleep. You may not sleep at all, or you may sleep for just a few hours and feel like you're totally fine. Often this is driven by high levels of creative energy, where you're just amped up and don't feel a need to sleep. When it comes to criteria like distractibility and involvement in risky behaviors, please keep in mind that these are counted toward diagnosing mania when they're a change from your typical behavior. For example, if you have ADHD and are almost always distractible, then we wouldn't consider that part of mania. We will explore the similarities and differences between bipolar and ADHD in one of the chapters because there are a lot of interesting potential overlaps. The last thing I want to point out is the final criterion, which is that at least one manic episode is required for a diagnosis of bipolar 1. You cannot be diagnosed with bipolar 1 unless you have had a documented manic episode that meets those criteria above. Now that we understand what a manic episode is, how does that fit into the diagnosis of bipolar? Isn't there a whole other mood state to consider? Yes, let's continue the criteria. Diagnostic criteria for bipolar 1 disorder. A, criteria have been met for at least one manic episode. B, the occurrence of manic and major depressive episodes is not better explained by schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, schizophreniform disorder, delusional disorder, or other specified or unspecified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorder. The B criteria above is certainly a mouthful, but did you notice what it did not include? It doesn't say that you must have depression. Technically speaking, you can have a diagnosis of bipolar with mania alone, although I will say this is much less common. The typical picture is somebody that has generally stable mood, punctuated with some episodes of major depression and recurrent manic episodes. Everyone is different though. I've certainly worked with people where they are not generally depressed, but mania creeps in and turns their life upside down from time to time. One thing you might not appreciate from reading the description is just how exhausting and depressing mania can be, especially in the aftermath. Can you imagine being up for 4 days straight, starting and stopping several projects, making impulsive decisions that you have to face the music about later, and neglecting your personal needs like eating properly? You can bet your ass that you'll be completely wiped and probably pretty bummed out afterward. Even if that doesn't throw you into a diagnosable major depressive episode, your mood will take a hit. This is a common vicious cycle in mania. Bipolar facts. According to the World Health Organization, around 40 million people live with bipolar disorder worldwide. The prevalence is approximately equal across genders, but women are most often diagnosed. Bipolar is one of the leading causes of disability globally. On average, people with bipolar disorder die more than 10 years earlier than the general population. Many people with bipolar are misdiagnosed or untreated. So that is bipolar 1. Throughout this book, I've included case studies to help you understand the various ways that the disorder can look. To start off with, let's examine a case that is fairly stereotypical for somebody diagnosed with bipolar 1. Case study, Olivia. Olivia is a 29-year-old social media manager for a nonprofit in the labor sector. She's always been known for her creativity and her ability to manage several projects at once. However, since she was a young adult, she's experienced changes in her mood that impact both her personal and professional life. In her younger life, Olivia experienced some bouts of depression where she would have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning and cried nearly every day. This was not totally surprising for her as she has an extensive family history of depression and anxiety. However, as she got older, she began to have what she now knows as manic episodes. During her manic episodes, Olivia has no sense of work-life balance. She stays up most of the night, only sleeping for a few hours per week, while she develops ambitious, large-scale campaigns for her nonprofit with little consideration for time commitment or resources. Further, she tends to exhibit signs of grandiosity. Shooting for the stars is great, but Olivia could be awake at 4 a.m. trying to DM celebrities and heads of state, fully expecting them to align with her cause. When at work, those who know her well can tell that Olivia is not her usual self when she's in a manic episode. She talks rapidly and bounces from one idea to the next. This makes her ideas and plans difficult for others at her organization to wrap their heads around. Olivia tends to have little patience for people that don't see her creative visions, and she typically bulldozes through conversations without paying heed to any constructive criticism she may be met with. Olivia's coworkers have also voiced their concerns about her self-care, as she usually develops large bags under her eyes, and her typically meticulous makeup appears haphazard. During her normal weeks, Olivia tends to have an upbeat mood, and she doesn't struggle with depression nearly as much as she did when she was younger. However, the period immediately following a manic episode is usually rough. The lack of sleep for days on end catches up with Olivia, so her body tries to compensate by making her sleep for 12 to 15 hours at a time. This is also when she needs to face the consequences of her choices and commitments that she made while manic, which she sometimes only has a hazy memory of. All that can be rather depressing, so Olivia's mood tends to plummet and her motivation for work hits an all-time low. After a week or so, Olivia's mood usually returns to her typical baseline. She's energetic but not hyperactive. She's ambitious but also realistic. She's extroverted, but she can also carry a two-way conversation with ease. Olivia's mood episodes can be intense, but realistically, she spends most of her time at this baseline state. In her time at the nonprofit, they have seen unprecedented engagement online, resulting in higher attendance at in-person events. Olivia is an asset to the company, mental health struggles and all. Throughout the rest of this book, we will examine ways to better cope with bipolar, such as medications, therapy, and even speaking with your employer to set expectations and obtain reasonable accommodations. We glossed over how Olivia manages her bipolar, but please keep in mind that many people with bipolar have amazing lives, loving relationships, and fulfilling careers. That doesn't mean that life with bipolar is easy, but with proper support and knowledge, it doesn't have to be the focal point of your entire story. How this book works. As I said at the top of this introduction, I host a weekly podcast called the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. In this show, I take listener questions about life, mental health, relationships, and more. This book is based on the actual questions that listeners have asked on the show. I wanted to take this approach because I'm very frustrated about how inaccessible and out of touch some mental health books can be. Why should I, the lofty, learned doctor, assume I know exactly what you want to learn about bipolar? Better to leave it to the experts, that is, the people actually living with the disorder. Because of this, the structure of the book is a little bit different than most books on bipolar. Each chapter is based on one question from the show. In the process of answering the question, I will also provide extra context about side topics that I didn't have the chance to dive deep into during the podcast episode. There are also a few chapters that are not based off questions from the show, which were included to round out the content and make sure certain topics were covered in the book. For example, the chapters on bipolar in children and how to navigate the workplace with bipolar seemed super important, but nobody had asked about them on the show. So rather than going through this book chapter by chapter, I would suggest you look at the table of contents to see which topics are of most interest to you. If there's a specific piece of information you'd like to search for, such as medications for bipolar or the definition of hypomania, you can also check out the index at the back. Thank you for checking out this book. Thank you for caring. Let's dive in. Episode 306, June 10th, 2022. Question. Hey Duff, last fall I started college for engineering, but was hospitalized by police about a week and a half in. Turns out I'm bipolar 1 with psychotic features. Oh well. I spent the past year working at a boba shop, interning at an animal sanctuary, and getting stable. Suddenly it's spring and college decision time has caught me off guard for the second time. With scholarships and financial aid in mind, my two best bets are a school close to home and the school that I attempted to attend this year. My mom believes that if I don't return to the original school, I won't be building the resiliency that I should from this experience. But I'm a little nervous about returning, especially considering the erratic behavior I exhibited while manic. Is she right? Any advice for getting up the courage to go back to college in general? This question perfectly illustrates how bipolar can emerge in young adulthood. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, the average age of onset for bipolar is around 25 years. While bipolar can emerge at any age, it's most common to begin in late adolescence or early adulthood. In the field of psychology, we talk about something called the diathesis stress model. This model explains how psychiatric disorders arise from a mix of genetic vulnerability and environmental stress. What we see in this question is probably a fantastic example of this model in practice. In this case, the person's genetic predisposition to bipolar was likely triggered by the stresses of starting college. In other instances, the stressor might be a loss of a relationship, somebody dying, or a career-related issue. Not everyone with the predisposition will develop a mental health disorder, nor will everyone that endures a period of significant life stress. However, this question is a strong example of how bipolar can surface in early adulthood. From the outside, people might be surprised that something like mania can come out of nowhere, but realistically, many people think they're simply depressed until mania is triggered by some sort of stressor. This person mentioned that they were hospitalized by the police about a week and a half into starting college. Let's talk a bit about why that might be the case. Laws governing involuntary psychiatric hospitalization vary by location. Here in California, USA, we call it a 5150, which refers to California Welfare and Institutions Code 5150. This law allows an individual to be hospitalized involuntarily in a psychiatric hospital for up to 72 hours for assessment, evaluation, and crisis intervention. The hold can be extended if necessary under other welfare codes, such as 5250, which allows for a 14-day hold. The laws about hospitalization vary from state to state, and they're certainly different depending on the country you live in. Generally speaking, there are three main reasons that somebody could be held involuntarily. The first is when somebody is in imminent danger to themselves. Typically, this means that they're planning to die by suicide or are actively making an attempt. It can also apply if somebody is engaging in other life-threatening behaviors, even if it's not overtly suicidal. Involuntary holds can also be performed when somebody presents a danger to others, meaning they're threatening physical harm toward someone else, or exhibiting behavior that is violent or could cause physical harm toward others. The last common reason is when somebody is considered gravely disabled, which indicates that they're unable to care for their basic personal needs like food, clothing, and shelter due to their mental disorder. So, how might someone with bipolar end up hospitalized? It could be for any of these reasons, but in the question here, it's most likely danger to self or others. During depressive episodes in the context of bipolar, suicidal thoughts are relatively common. Conversely, during active mania, the person might engage in extremely risky behaviors that put their life or the life of others at risk, such as driving dangerously or firing a firearm in inappropriate places. Even though we typically think of mania as being a euphoric state, suicidality is also something that can happen, as people might be desperate for relief from the intensity of the experience. In these instances, hospitalization is vital because they may be even more likely to attempt suicide due to impulsivity. For the person in the question, they mentioned that they had bipolar with psychotic features, meaning they may have had hallucinations or delusional thoughts. I've witnessed people with psychosis act out in ways that are violent due to their perception that they need to defend themselves. For example, I was once kicked and pushed by a woman that appeared to be psychotic in a busy public area while she yelled about something that clearly had nothing to do with me. I didn't notify anybody about the event because it was minimal and she quickly moved on. But if it was a more extreme demonstration of that sort of behavior, someone might feel threatened enough to call the police, resulting in an involuntary hospitalization. Either way, I can't imagine how tough that must have been to go to a new school, quickly decompensate into active mania and psychosis, and then have their behavior elevate to the point that they were hospitalized. That's so very rough. And I can understand why they may be hesitant to return to the same school. Unfortunately, when it comes to mania, things don't just end neatly once the phase passes. Afterward, you often have to deal with the wreckage left behind. Missed classes, skipped work, self-harm, or saying things you regret, these all have consequences, even if your memory is hazy. The physical and emotional fallout from mania can sometimes make it difficult to not slip straight into a depressive episode as well. Sometimes the right move is to push through. Other times, stepping back to regroup is a smarter choice. I'm very proud of the person that wrote this question for recognizing that they needed that time. It sounds like they took the leave of absence from school to focus on getting stabilized. To some, that may feel like a failure. To me, that's one of the strongest and most responsible things that you can do. Breaks can be very tricky because it's easy to fall into patterns that do not support growth and recovery, which will then lead to feelings of guilt for wasting time. That's not the case here. This person isn't just binging shows on Netflix all day. They're working, interning, and trying to get their mental health in order. Badass. When it comes to getting back into school or work after an event like this, there are some things to consider. Presumably, part of getting back on track during this break was getting appropriate treatment for bipolar symptoms. Having the right meds and support system is a total game changer. That shouldn't be underestimated. Even if the environment remains stressful and carries the painful memories of what happened prior to leaving, you're simply in a different place when you have the right support. This question brings up the idea of resiliency. I think that even considering going back to school is brave and demonstrates resilience. The person's mother has an understandable concern. In general, when we avoid places or situations that cause us anxiety and distress, that aversion grows. Imagine you had a terrifying flight where an engine caught fire. You landed safely, but avoided flying after that. You would drive or take trains, which was a much longer trip, but it helped you avoid the inevitable anxiety of being on a plane again. However, at some point you have to go overseas for work. It's an unavoidable situation, but you're going to have massive anxiety due to all of the avoidance since just the initial plane scare. If instead you continued going on planes after the accident, even though it was scary, that anxiety would progressively get easier to deal with until it's not a barrier at all. This is called exposure. It's a central tenet of therapy for anxiety disorders, and it also applies to bipolar in situations like this. There's no clear-cut answer to whether they should return to their old school or start fresh. If the school is a perfect fit for this person's goals and there are very clear reasons they should be there instead of going to another institution, it may be worth facing those fears by approaching instead of avoiding. However, it's also just a few years of college we're talking about here. It's not the end-all be-all. Every situation is different, but for the most part, once you have your undergraduate degree, it doesn't really matter where you went to school. I would say that it's more important to make sure you're going somewhere that can provide you with the resources and experience that you need to move in your desired direction, whether that's into the workforce or into additional graduate schooling. This is a good opportunity to bust out the handy pros and cons chart to evaluate each potential school. For now, let's set aside the potential trauma of hospitalization and focus on practical factors. Instead, consider distance from home, resources for your mental health, resources for your academic work, funding, and the environment of the school. There are certainly advantages to going to a school near home since you can have easy access to your support system if needed. At the same time, one of the most beneficial aspects of college, in my opinion, is the chance to have a practice adulthood. You get to learn how to care for yourself and become more independent in a way that has a built-in structure still and some degree of a safety net. Bipolar is a condition with a low rate of spontaneous remission, meaning that it's probably not going to go away on its own. That means you'll need to learn how to live life in the context of bipolar. Therefore, approaching difficult situations, such as college, is a great way to build the strategies and find the resources needed to live a successful life with bipolar. There is so much power in knowing. Your first manic phase can be terrifying. It's like when somebody with panic disorder has their first panic attack. You don't know how to deal with it because it's never happened to you before. After getting a diagnosis and finding appropriate tools to manage the mood shifts, you're in a much better position to live your life without bipolar completely derailing it. For example, if you're able to recognize that one of your common triggers for mania is an increase in stress, which is relatively predictable around finals week or performance reviews in the workplace, you can make sure that your support network and care team are ready to spring into action should you need them. You can also use trusted friends, family members, or care providers as a source of feedback to let you know if they see signs of you slipping into significant depression or mania. Another aspect to address in this question is the social ramifications of what happened. The person mentioned that they're nervous to return to school considering the erratic behaviors they exhibited. I don't want to underplay the significance of this. It's easy for me to sit back and say it doesn't matter what people think, but I've never experienced active psychosis in front of friends and or strangers. The nerves that this person feels about going back to school are totally understandable. However, I would also say that in general, this sort of social threat is often largely exaggerated in our heads. People have short memories, especially in large universities. You're unlikely to face a dramatic, everybody staring and whispering moment like in a teen movie when you come back. In the question, they also mentioned that they were only at school for about a week and a half before this happened. So realistically, this event was a small blip on the timeline of their academic career. It's allowed to be nerve-wracking, but the embarrassment and social anxiety will fade quickly, provided the cycle of avoidance doesn't keep up. Ultimately, going back to school after having such an intense introduction to the wonderful world of mania is a very brave thing. I think it's strong as hell. Wherever this person ended up going, I'm sure they're doing way better now than they were before being hospitalized. With proper support, it's completely possible to have a successful undergraduate career. And if it turns out that college simply does not work out due to the severity of their symptoms or any other reason, that's also not the end of the world. They could stop again and pivot to another course of action, or they could go back to school at a later time. At college age, you're not supposed to have everything figured out, so there's no shame in taking chances, making mistakes, and figuring it out as you go. The last thing I wanted to leave you with in this section is some guidance about speaking with schools or places of employment about bipolar when you may need formal accommodations or time off. Speaking with schools or employers about bipolar. It can be challenging to navigate school or work with bipolar, but as good little cogs in the machine of capitalism, it is alas what we must do. A solid strategy can make all the difference in maintaining stability while meeting your needs. Here are some things to consider. Understanding your rights. In the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and the Rehabilitation Act are federal laws that protect individuals with disabilities, including mental health conditions, from discrimination. These laws also require schools and workplaces to provide reasonable accommodations. As with other sections in this book, the information here is USA-centric. However, many other countries have comparable laws, so please be sure to investigate the laws governing these issues in your place of residence. Colleges and universities typically have an office dedicated to disabilities and accessibility. They vary in name, such as Office of Student Disability Services, Disabled Students Program, and Disability Services Office. Like the workplace, colleges and universities also have requirements to provide reasonable accommodations under the Rehabilitation Act. One of the primary benefits of a disability office on campus is that you typically do not need to disclose directly to the professors of your classes. Deciding whether to disclose. Disclosure of your mental health status or any other disability is strictly voluntary. You don't have to disclose, and it's important to consider the risks and benefits of doing so. Your health status, including mental health, belongs to you. You get to decide the flow of information. However, it is worth considering whether the discomfort of telling your school or work about your mental health might lead to a serious improvement in your work or school life. As mentioned above, schools and places of work are often required to provide adjustments and accommodations for those impacted by a disability. Disclosing may be your gateway to accessing these tools. However, if you're managing well without any additional help, you don't necessarily need to disclose. You're allowed to wait and keep your diagnosis private until a need arises. How to disclose. That's all well and good, but how do you actually go about the process of disclosing? What do you need to say? This is an area that trips a lot of people up, and it probably causes some to say, forget it. Here are some things to consider so this doesn't limit you. Start by identifying exactly which department or agency you need to contact. For schools, this will typically be something like the Disability Services Office. For work, this could be the Human Resources Department, or HR, at larger companies, or simply your supervisor or boss at a smaller company. For schools and larger companies, often there's a section of the website or handbook that addresses what the requirements are for requesting accommodations. This might simply be a note from your medical provider, or a more extensive evaluation in the case of a learning disability or cognitive impairment. For example, as a neuropsychologist, when I'm evaluating somebody for potential accommodations, I frequently reference the specific requirements listed on the website of their school or place of work when I'm crafting the battery of tests. It varies from place to place, so don't be afraid to ask. For example, if the information is not clear on the website or other resources, you could contact the relevant person in your disability office or HR department and ask something like, I'm interested in seeking accommodations for my disability, which is documented in my medical records. However, I don't see specific requirements listed on the website regarding documentation. Could you please point me in the right direction? For school, you typically do not need to provide all the details when it comes to mental health diagnoses. For learning disabilities, you may need to give more information so that the specific accommodations can be selected given your cognitive and academic profile. But for mental health, it's usually enough to simply state that you have a mental health condition for which you require accommodations. For the workplace, you may want to frame the discussion around how accommodations would allow you to perform your job effectively rather than focusing solely on the symptoms. There are also a few practical considerations to keep in mind. When it comes to timing, you will probably want to disclose and ask for resources when you're not already in active crisis, and you can articulate your needs most clearly. Planning ahead certainly can make this a smoother process. Also, while there are certain protections from the government that dictate the ways in which schools and workplaces are supposed to support people with disabilities, it doesn't always work out that way. Especially in geographic regions that are not very supportive of people with disabilities in general, or within smaller organizations that simply have never had to think about these issues before. When there is no standardized protocol for seeking accommodations, the point from above about framing the accommodations in a way that emphasizes the way it would allow you to perform your work more successfully is even more essential. To be clear, this is to avoid discrimination from people that aren't with the program when it comes to accommodating people with disabilities. Ideally, you wouldn't have to strategize so much since they're technically required to operate within the bounds of the regulations we talked about, but sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. Sample script for seeking accommodations. For school, I have a documented medical condition that impacts my ability to manage stress and maintain energy levels. I'd like to request accommodations to make sure that I can succeed academically. I have documentation from my healthcare provider. Could you please advise me on the next steps? For work, I have a medical condition that sometimes impacts my daily functioning. I'd like to discuss potential accommodations that would help me remain productive and continue contributing effectively to the team. Please let me know how you would like to move forward. I can provide you with documentation from my medical provider if necessary. When it comes to the specific accommodations to ask for, this again comes down to the organization that you're asking. Schools have common accommodations, including extending time on exams, flexible attendance policies, priority registration, note-taking assistance, a separate room for taking exams, and access to resources and services on campus. The workplace can vary drastically, but you might see flexible work hours, remote work options, quieter workspaces, or the ability to wear noise-canceling headphones, extended deadlines when in the midst of a mood episode, and the ability to take medical leave if symptoms become severe. Hopefully, if you ask for accommodations, you'll be worked with in a compassionate and flexible way. But what if your boss or school pushes back and denies your request for assistance? This is where you may have to advocate for yourself a bit more. You could go to your doctor and get additional documentation. They may also have some advice for you, given that they probably provided medical documentation for others seeking accommodations before. You could also bring their attention to the relevant laws and regulations that state that they must provide reasonable accommodations. If there's a portion of the website or handbook that gives information on accommodations for disabilities, you can also provide that information. In schools and larger organizations, there may be ways to formally appeal the decision. Don't lose hope if you need to appeal. Many people get approved with persistence. I've seen many cases where people are initially denied resources before they appeal, and then they're able to get the accommodations they need on the second or third try. If you feel daunted by this, you could also look for a disability services coordinator or legal representation to help advocate on your behalf. If you feel like you're being discriminated against, you have the option of filing a complaint with the Equal Opportunity Commission, EEOC, for workplace issues, or the Office of Civil Rights, OCR, for school-related concerns. As with many situations that involve the intersection of medical and legal issues, it's a great idea to keep a paper trail. After you discuss accommodations, follow up with an email or writing to confirm what was discussed and agreed upon. You should also keep all copies of your correspondence, medical documentation, and any formal accommodation letters you may receive. Advocating for accommodations at school or work can feel intimidating, but it's often a necessary step for long-term success. Remember, you're not asking for special treatment. You're trying to make sure that you have the tools and support needed to succeed. It's the responsible thing to do. With the right support, you can thrive at school or work while effectively managing bipolar. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed this snippet of the book, Bipolar Answers. Please don't forget it's available for pre-order now. Follow the link in the description or the show notes, and I'll of course keep you updated when the ebook, when the print book, and when the audiobook go live. It's been a passion project of mine for a while now, and I'm super excited for you to read it. Thank you.